Hey there, welcome back. Before we dive in, take a deep breath and let the stress of the day melt away. I'm really glad you're here, and I'd love to get to know you better. So if you had to choose, what would be your favourite food? Let me know in the comments. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. And enjoy. The morning mist clung to the Virginia hills like the breath of ghosts, and 17-year-old Elias Rowe moved through it with the practiced silence of someone who had learned early that making noise brought unwanted tension. His boots, worn thin at the soles and patched with scraps of leather, made barely a whisper against the dew-soaked earth as he slipped away from the ramshackle farmhouse where his uncle Jeremiah still lay sleeping off another night's worth of corn whiskey. Elias had been orphaned at 12 when fever took both his parents within a week of each other, leaving him with nothing but a few books, his father's old surveying tools, and the dubious mercy of his father's younger brother. Jeremiah Rowe was a hard man made harder by drink and failure, his small farm perpetually on the edge of ruin, his temper as unpredictable as summer storms. The boy had learned to make himself scarce during the worst of it, disappearing into the dense forest that surrounded their property with an ease that would have impressed even the Cherokee who had once called this land home. Today, like so many others, Elias sought refuge in exploration. He carried with him a leather satchel containing his father's compass, a few pieces of jerky wrapped in cloth, a small journal bound in cracked leather, and his most prized possession, a collection of sketches and notes about the native peoples who had once lived in these mountains. His father had been fascinated by their culture, their connection to the land, and had filled Elias's childhood with stories of their ceremonies, their wisdom, and their mysterious disappearance from the region. The forest called to him with promises of discovery. Every hollow might conceal arrowheads, every outcropping of rock might reveal petroglyphs, every cave might hold secrets from the people who had vanished like morning mist before the advancing tide of European settlement. Elias had already found several sites, a circle of stones that might have been a ceremonial ring, scattered pottery shards that he carefully catalogued and sketched, and most recently stories from old-timers in the near settlement about a cave deep in Raven's Hollow that the Cherokee had considered sacred, or perhaps cursed. The locals called it the Whispering Cave, claiming that strange sounds emerged from its depths during storms, that animals avoided it, and that more than one hunter had emerged from its vicinity speaking of visions and dreams that felt more real than waking life. Such tales only fueled Elias's curiosity. He had spent weeks preparing for this expedition, studying his father's survey maps, gathering supplies, and waiting for the right opportunity to slip away unnoticed. The path to Raven's Hollow was treacherous, winding through dense undergrowth and over rocky terrain that had likely remained unchanged since the last ice age. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even at midday the forest floor remained dim and mysterious. Elias moved with growing excitement, his senses sharp and alert to every sound, every play of light and shadow. When he finally reached the hollow, he understood immediately why the Cherokee had considered this place special. The very air seemed different here, heavier, more charged, as if the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds had worn thin. The cave entrance yawned before him like a mouth in the hillside, partially concealed by hanging moss and twisted vines that seemed to grow in patterns too deliberate to be natural. Elias lit his torch with trembling hands and stepped into the darkness. The cave was larger than he had expected, its walls smooth and curved as if shaped by water over countless centuries. His torchlight revealed strange formations in the rock, not quite natural, not quite carved, that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering flame. The deeper he went, the stronger became a peculiar sensation, as if he were walking not just through space but through time itself. The passage opened into a circular chamber that took his breath away. The walls were covered in petroglyphs more elaborate and detailed than anything he had seen in his father's books or his own explorations. Spirals and symbols, human figures and animal forms, astronomical charts and what appeared to be maps of territories that no longer existed, all carved with a precision and artistry that spoke of deep spiritual significance. But it was the far wall that truly stunned him. Embedded in the living rock so perfectly integrated that it seemed to have grown there rather than been placed, was a mirror of polished obsidian unlike anything he had ever imagined. It was roughly circular, perhaps 3 feet in diameter, its surface so perfectly smooth that it seemed to drink in his torchlight rather than reflect it. Around its perimeter, carved into the stone itself, were symbols that seemed to pulse and writhe in the dancing flame. Elias approached slowly, his scientific mind warring with a growing sense of awe and unease. The obsidian was clearly ancient, yet it showed no signs of wear or damage. Its surface was flawless, like a pool of still water turned to stone. As he drew closer, he began to make out his reflection, but it seemed strange, distorted, as if he was seeing not just himself, but multiple versions of himself layered one upon another. Thunder rumbled overhead, and Elias realized with a start that storm clouds had been gathering while he explored. The sound echoed strangely in the chamber, seeming to come from all directions at once. Lightning illuminated the cave entrance briefly, and in that instant the obsidian mirror seemed to flicker with an inner light. Driven by curiosity and the reckless courage of youth, Elias reached out to touch the mirror's surface. The moment his fingertips made contact with the obsidian, the world exploded into chaos. Light, brilliant, searing, impossible light, erupted from the mirror's surface. The petroglyphs on the walls began to glow as if lit from within, their symbols writhing and dancing like living things. The thunder outside became a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, and Elias felt a sensation like falling, though his feet remained firmly planted on the cave floor. The obsidian mirror rippled like water under his touch, and suddenly he was not touching a solid surface but reaching into something vast and liquid and alive. A force beyond his understanding seized him, pulling him forward into the mirror's depths. He tried to pull back, but it was like trying to escape a river in flood. The light grew brighter, the roar louder, and then silence. Elias woke to the sound of birdsong unlike any he had ever heard. Complex, musical, hauntingly beautiful. He lay on soft earth carpeted with moss and fallen leaves, but the trees above him were different from those he knew. These were giants, old-growth forest that stretched up into a canopy so high and dense that only scattered beams of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The air itself felt different, cleaner, wilder, charged with life and possibility. He sat up slowly, his head spinning with confusion and disorientation. His torch was gone, but he didn't need it. Streams of golden sunlight provided illumination that revealed a world transformed. The forest around him was pristine, untouched by axe or plough, teeming with life in a way that the woods of his own time never were. Massive chestnuts and oaks rose like cathedral pillars, their trunks so wide that a dozen men couldn't encircle them with joined hands. Beneath them grew an understory of species he couldn't identify, flowers in colours more vivid than any he had seen, berries that gleamed like jewels. But it was the sounds that truly convinced him something extraordinary had happened. Not just the complex bird song, but the rustle of large animals moving through the undergrowth without fear, the splash of fish jumping in a nearby stream that ran clearer than crystal, the whisper of wind through leaves that seemed to carry voices and music from another world. Elias stood on unsteady legs, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had he struck his head in the cave? Was this some vivid hallucination brought on by injury or exposure? But the sensations were too real, too complete. The scent of wild herbs and flowers, the feeling of moss beneath his feet, the play of light and shadow. Everything was more intense, more alive than his ordinary world. A rustling in the bushes nearby brought him sharply to attention. Something large was moving through the undergrowth, something that moved with the fluid grace of a predator. Elias's blood turned to ice as a massive bear emerged from the vegetation. Not the black bears he knew from his own time, but something larger and more formidable, with fur that gleamed silver-brown in the filtered sunlight, and eyes that held an intelligence both ancient and dangerous. The bear regarded him with what seemed like curiosity rather than aggression, but Elias knew better than to trust such appearances. He began backing away slowly, trying to remember everything his father had taught him about wilderness survival. Don't run, don't make sudden movements, don't look directly into its eyes. But the bear continued to approach, and Elias could see the massive claws, the powerful muscles beneath the fur, the sheer size of the creature. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm him, the sharp whistle of an arrow split the air. The shaft struck the ground between Elias and the bear, and the animal looked up with what seemed like resignation rather than fear. More arrows followed, not aimed to kill, but to drive the bear away, and after a moment of tense standoff, the great creature turned and melted back into the forest with surprising grace. Elias spun around to see his rescuers emerging from the trees like spirits materializing from the green twilight. There were 5 of them, and they moved with a silence and fluidity that made his own woodland skills seem clumsy by comparison. They were Native Americans, but not like any he had seen in illustrations or descriptions. These were people of the deep forest, their clothing made from finely worked hides and decorated with intricate beadwork and painted designs. Their faces were strong and weathered, marked with tattoos and paint that seemed to tell stories he couldn't read. The leader was a man of perhaps 40 years, his long black hair bound with feathers and carved bone ornaments. His eyes were dark and penetrating, missing nothing as they studied this strange pale boy who had appeared in their territory. Behind him stood 2 younger men who might have been his sons, their hands still resting on their bows, and 2 women, one middle-aged with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, and one much younger, perhaps 16, whose gaze held a peculiar intensity as she stared at Elias. The leader spoke in a language that flowed like water over stones, musical and complex, full of nuances that Elias couldn't begin to understand. When he didn't respond, the man switched to what sounded like a different dialect, then another, his voice growing more impatient with each attempt. Finally he gestured sharply and the 2 younger men moved to flank Elias, their intentions clear. "Wait," Elias said, holding up his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "I mean no harm. I'm lost. I don't know how I got here." The words seemed to surprise them. The older woman stepped forward and spoke rapidly to the leader, her tone urgent. The younger woman, little more than a girl really, tilted her head as if listening to something only she could hear, then spoke in the same flowing language. Whatever she said caused the others to look at Elias with new interest, their hostility giving way to something that might have been wonder. The girl approached him slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful. She was beautiful in a way that seemed to belong to this wild place. Her skin bronzed by sun and wind, her hair black as a raven's wing and decorated with small carved ornaments that caught the light, her eyes the colour of deep forest pools. When she spoke, her voice was soft but filled with certainty. "You are the one from the sky stories," she said, in accented but clear English. "The one who walks between the times." Elias stared at her in shock. Not only could she speak his language, but her words suggested knowledge of his impossible situation. "You speak English? How do you... Where am I? When am I?" The girl smiled, and it transformed her face entirely. "I am a Hyoka. I learned the tongue of the Eastern peoples from traders who came when I was small. But you are not from the East. You are from the time that has not come." Before Elias could respond, the leader barked something sharp and a Hyoka stepped back, her expression becoming more formal. The older woman gestured impatiently, and the group began to move deeper into the forest, clearly expecting Elias to follow. He looked around at the pristine wilderness, at the weapons and clothing that belonged to no European culture he knew, at the faces that regarded him with mixtures of suspicion and awe, and realized he had no choice but to trust these strangers. They travelled for hours through country that grew more beautiful and wild with each mile. Elias saw animals he had never imagined, flocks of birds with feathers like living jewels, deer so numerous they moved through the forest like flowing water, streams so clear he could count the pebbles on the bottom from 20 feet away. This was North America, as it had existed before European settlement, before the Great Dying, before the forests were cleared and the buffalo slaughtered and the native peoples driven from their ancestral lands. As they walked, a Hyoka fell into step beside him, ignoring the disapproving looks from the others. She pointed out plants and animals, teaching him their names in her language, telling him stories about their spiritual significance. Her English was limited but improving with use, and Elias found himself fascinated not just by her knowledge, but by the way she saw the world. Everything connected, everything alive, everything part of a great web of relationships that extended far beyond the merely physical. "My grandmother dreams of you," she said as they paused to rest beside a spring that bubbled up from moss-covered rocks. "She says the sky people told her of one who would come when the wheel of time turns crooked, one who carries the knowledge of what will be, but has forgotten the wisdom of what is." "Sky people?" Elias asked, accepting a drink from a water skin that tasted of herbs and something indefinably wild. Ahyoka gestured toward the canopy above, where the last light of day filtered through the leaves. The ancestors who became stars, they watch over us, guide us, sometimes send us dreams and visions. They told my grandmother that the mirrors would wake again, that someone would come through the spirit paths to help prepare for the time of great change. Mirrors? The word sent a chill through Elias as he remembered the obsidian surface, the impossible light, the sensation of falling through dimensions. The sky mirrors, Ahyoka said, her voice dropping to a whisper, made by the first people, before the great ice, before the world changed. They are doorways between the times, but they were sealed long ago because the spirit said it was dangerous to walk between then and now and will be. As night fell, they reached the village, and Elias understood immediately that he had stepped into a world beyond his wildest imagination. The settlement was not the collection of crude huts he might have expected from his limited knowledge of Native American life, but a sophisticated community of perhaps 300 people, their dwellings arranged in careful patterns that seemed to follow the natural contours of the land. The houses themselves were marvels of engineering and artistry, some built of wood and bark in styles that varied according to family and clan, others partially dug into hillsides and covered with earth, and growing plants that made them almost invisible from a distance. Garden plots were integrated seamlessly with the natural landscape, growing not just corn and beans and squash, but dozens of other crops in carefully planned combinations that seemed to mimic the diversity of the forest itself. But it was the people who truly amazed him. These were not the savages of European imagination, but a complex society with its own philosophers and artists, its own scientists and historians, its own intricate social structures and spiritual practices. Children played games that were clearly designed to teach hunting and gathering skills, while also being genuinely fun. Adults worked with tools and techniques that showed generations of refinement and improvement. Elderly men and women sat in places of honour, their words listened to with respect and attention. The arrival of the group with their strange pale captive, for that's clearly what Elias was, despite the relatively gentle treatment, caused a stir throughout the village. People emerged from their homes to stare at him, some with curiosity, others with suspicion or even fear. He heard his presence discussed in rapid conversations he couldn't follow, saw children peering at him from behind their mothers' skirts, felt the weight of dozens of eyes studying his every movement. The leader, whom Elias learned was called Adahi, meaning lives in the woods, brought him to the centre of the village, where a large fire burned in a carefully constructed pit surrounded by carved stones. Around the fire sat the village elders, men and women whose faces bore the wisdom and weariness of many winters. They studied Elias with expressions that ranged from sceptical to hostile, and he realised his life might well depend on the next few minutes. An ancient woman, her hair white as snow and her face mapped with lines of age and experience, rose from her place by the fire. This, Ahyoka whispered, was her grandmother, Galilahi, whose name meant attractive, but who was known throughout the region for her spiritual power and prophetic dreams. She approached Elias slowly, her eyes never leaving his face, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed. Ahyoka translated, her voice tense with nervousness. She asks if you are the one who stepped through the sky mirror, the one who comes from the time of dying to learn the time of living. Elias looked around at the circle of faces, all waiting for his answer. How could he explain what he didn't understand himself? How could he tell these people about the world he came from, a world where their descendants would be driven from their lands, their languages forbidden, their children stolen and forced into schools designed to kill the native within them? I don't know, he said finally. I was in a cave in my own time. I found a mirror made of black stone covered with symbols like those on your grandmother's medicine bag. When I touched it during a storm, everything changed. I woke up here, in your forest, in your time. As Ahyoka translated, Galilahi's expression grew more intense. She asked another question, and this time Ahyoka hesitated before translating. She wants to know what you have seen in your dreams since you arrived. She says the sky mirrors show truth to those who pass through them, but only in dreams and visions. Elias started to say he hadn't dreamed at all, then stopped. Now that he thought about it, he had been having strange dreams, fragments of images and sensations that felt more like memories than fantasies. Vast herds of animals stretching to the horizon, rivers that ran clean and cold from mountain to sea, forests that covered the continent from coast to coast. But also darker images, ships on the horizon, men with pale faces and strange clothes, the sound of gunfire and the smell of smoke. "I've seen your world as it was," he said slowly. "The great forests, the herds of buffalo, the rivers full of fish. But I've also seen darkness coming, men from across the water, bringing sickness and war and changes that will transform everything." The translation of his words caused a stir among the elders. Some looked frightened, others angry, still others thoughtful. Galilahi asked another question, and Ahyoka's face paled as she listened. She asks if you have seen the time of the great dying, when 9 of every 10 people will walk the ghost trail, when the buffalo will disappear like smoke, when the forest will be cut and the rivers poisoned. Elias felt as if a cold hand had gripped his heart. These people couldn't know about the diseases that European contact would bring, the wars of conquest, the systematic destruction of their way of life. Yet somehow this old woman was describing exactly what he knew from his history books would happen. "Yes," he whispered, "I've seen that time." Galilahi nodded as if she had expected his answer, then spoke at length to the assembled elders. The discussion that followed was intense and sometimes heated, with voices raised in argument and hands gesturing emphatically. Finally, the old shaman raised her hand for silence and pronounced what sounded like a judgment. "You will stay with us," Ahyoka translated, relief evident in her voice. "You will learn our ways, share in our work, become one of the people. My grandmother says the Sky Spirit sent you to learn what must be preserved when the time of great change comes, but she also warns that your presence here may hasten that change, that by stepping through the sky mirror you may have weakened the barriers between the times." And so began the strangest period of Elias's life. The village accepted him with the cautious hospitality they might show to any refugee, but his obvious foreignness, his pale skin, his strange clothes, his complete ignorance of skills that every child learned, marked him as different in ways that couldn't be overcome by good intentions alone. Adahi, the man who had found him, took responsibility for his education with the grim determination of someone assigned an unpleasant but necessary task. Elias learned to make fire without flint and steel, using bow drill and tinder in ways that required patience and skill he had never developed. He learned to track animals by reading signs so subtle they seemed like magic. A bent twig here, a partial footprint there, the way birds behaved when large game had passed through their territory. Hunting was even more challenging. These people didn't simply kill animals for food, they entered into a spiritual relationship with their prey, offering prayers and tobacco, taking only what was needed, using every part of what they killed. Elias struggled not just with the technical skills of using bow and arrow, but with the entire philosophy that surrounded the act of taking life to sustain life. But it was the language that proved most difficult. What Ahyoka called her tongue was actually a complex system of communication that went far beyond mere words. Tone, gesture, context, even the time of day and season could change the meaning of a simple phrase. Stories were told with layers of meaning that revealed themselves only after years of study, and the most important knowledge was often embedded in songs and ceremonies that were shared only with those who had proven their commitment to the people. Ahyoka became his primary teacher and gradually his closest friend. She had a gift for languages that amazed him. Not only did she speak several native dialects and enough English to communicate with traders, but she seemed to understand the underlying structures that made language possible. She could take concepts from his world and find ways to express them in hers, building bridges between ways of thinking that seemed completely incompatible. Through her, Elias began to understand that what he had always thought of as primitive life was actually incredibly sophisticated. The village existed in perfect harmony with its environment, not through ignorance or lack of ambition, but through generations of careful observation and experimentation. They knew which plants could be harvested sustainably and which needed to be left alone, how to encourage the growth of useful species without destroying the overall ecosystem, how to live as part of the natural world rather than in opposition to it. Their spiritual life was equally complex. What European observers might have dismissed as superstition was actually a sophisticated understanding of psychology, ecology, and what could only be called physics. They knew that everything in the universe was connected. that actions in one realm affected all others, that the past, present, and future existed simultaneously in what they called the Great Circle of Time. It was this understanding that made them uniquely capable of accepting Elias's impossible story. They didn't question whether time travel was possible. Their entire worldview assumed that linear time was an illusion, that the truly real existed outside the normal flow of days and seasons. What concerned them was not how he had come to be among them, but why, and what his presence might mean for the future of their people. As autumn gave way to winter, Elias began to experience what he could only describe as visions. They came during meditation, during ceremony, sometimes even during ordinary activities like gathering firewood or helping with food preparation. He would suddenly find himself seeing through other eyes, experiencing other times, understanding connections that spanned centuries. He saw the obsidian mirrors being created by a people even more ancient than the current inhabitants of the village. They were master craftsmen who understood the properties of volcanic glass, but also shamans who could work with spiritual forces that Elias barely comprehended. The mirrors were not just doorways through time, but instruments for maintaining balance in the universe, ways of preventing the timeline from becoming too rigid or too chaotic. But something had gone wrong. The vision stories told of mirrors that had been used carelessly, of people who travelled through time for personal gain rather than spiritual necessity, of changes in the past that created ripples extending far into the future. The ancient people had finally sealed most of the mirrors, hiding them in sacred places and surrounding them with warnings and protections. The mirror Elias had found was one of the last, hidden in the cave system that the Cherokee had avoided for generations. His accidental activation had torn open a pathway that was supposed to remain closed, and every day he remained in the past increased the danger of paradox and chaos. Winter brought new challenges, but also deeper integration into the life of the village. Elias learned to appreciate the long evenings when the community gathered around fires to share stories, to work on crafts that required patience and skill, to plan for the coming year. He discovered that he had a talent for the intricate beadwork that decorated clothing and ceremonial objects, his steady hands and attention to detail making him valuable, despite his other limitations. More importantly, he began to understand the stories. What had seemed like simple folk tales when Ahyoka first translated them, revealed themselves as complex repositories of scientific knowledge, historical information, and spiritual wisdom. Stories about animals contained detailed information about behavior and ecology. Tales of heroes and spirits encoded practical instructions for everything from agriculture to astronomy. Accounts of the time before preserved memories of geological and climatological changes that stretched back thousands of years. And threaded through many of the stories were references to the sky mirrors and the people who had travelled between times. Elias realised that he was not the first person to fall through the temporal barriers. The oral traditions contained dozens of accounts of strangers who appeared mysteriously, lived among the people for a while, then disappeared just as suddenly. Some had been helpful, sharing knowledge that proved valuable. Others had been disruptive, bringing changes that upset the careful balance of tribal life. "My grandmother says you're different from the other Skywalkers," Ahyoka told him one evening, as they sat by the fire working on a winter robe decorated with astronomical symbols. "Most of them try to change things, to make our world more like theirs. But you try to change yourself, to become more like us." "Maybe that's because I don't have a world to go back to," Elias replied, surprised by the bitterness in his own voice. "My uncle doesn't care whether I live or die. I have no friends, no prospects, nothing but more of the same grinding poverty and ignorance." Ahyoka looked at him with the serious expression she wore when working through a difficult translation. "The words you use, poverty and ignorance, they don't mean what you think they mean. You come from a time of great riches, but your people are poor in spirit. You come from a time of much knowledge, but your people are ignorant of wisdom." "What do you mean?" She gestured toward the village around them, where people were going about their evening activities with quiet contentment. "Here, no one goes hungry unless everyone goes hungry. No one lacks shelter unless everyone lacks shelter. Children are raised by the whole community. Old people are honoured and cared for. Everyone has work that is valued and meaningful. In your time, you have great buildings and powerful tools, but people live alone and die alone. Many have no work or work that serves no good purpose. The weak are left to suffer while the strong take more than they need." Elias wanted to argue, but he couldn't. everything she said was true. His own time, for all its technological advantages, was marked by inequality, loneliness and spiritual emptiness that these primitive people had somehow avoided. As winter deepened, so did his connection to the community. He participated in ceremonies that revealed layers of meaning each time they were performed, learned songs that were also scientific treatises and historical chronicles, helped with the everyday work of maintaining life in harmony with the natural world. For the first time in his life, he felt as if he belonged somewhere, as if his existence had meaning and purpose. But the visions were growing stronger and more disturbing. He saw the mirrors cracking, reality bleeding through from multiple timelines, the careful balance that the ancient people had established beginning to collapse. Each night brought dreams of chaos and confusion, of a world where past and future existed simultaneously, where cause and effect became meaningless, where the very fabric of time began to unravel. Galilahi, the old shaman, confirmed his worst fears during a private consultation in her lodge. She cast the sacred bones and read the patterns with growing concern, then spoke in her own language for several minutes before a yoka could translate. She says the sky mirror you came through is still open, still pulling energy from our time into yours. Every day you remain here makes the opening wider, makes it more likely that others will fall through, that the barriers between times will collapse completely. But surely that would take years, Elias protested. Decades, maybe centuries. Ayoka shook her head after another exchange with her grandmother. Time moves differently near the mirrors. What seems like months to you may be only days in your own time, but the damage accumulates faster than normal time. She says we may have only until the spring thaw before the situation becomes too dangerous to repair. Repair how? The answer, when it came, chilled him to the bone. According to the ancient stories, a mirror that had been opened improperly could only be sealed by someone passing back through it from the inside, essentially closing the door behind them. But the passage was dangerous even under the best circumstances, and attempting it with an already unstable mirror could easily result in the traveller being lost forever in the spaces between times. There is another way, Galilahi said through Ahyoka. The old stories speak of a second mirror, hidden in the sacred cave where the first people performed the ceremonies that shaped the world. If you could reach it, you could use it to return to your own time while simultaneously drawing the power from the broken mirror, sealing both passages. Where is this sacred cave? The answer was not encouraging. The site was 3 days' journey to the north, through territory controlled by tribes that were not always friendly to Ayoka's people. Worse, the cave was said to be protected by spirits that did not welcome visitors, and the mirror inside it was supposed to be even more dangerous than the one Elias had found. A master mirror that connected to all the others, capable of opening passages to any time, anywhere. But as winter began to give way to spring, the signs of temporal disturbance became impossible to ignore. Animals began behaving strangely, appearing in the wrong seasons, sometimes aging rapidly or reverting to juvenile forms overnight. Plants bloomed and died in chaotic cycles that followed no natural pattern. Worst of all, some of the villagers began experiencing what they called time dreams, visions of possible futures that were so vivid they seemed more real than waking life. Elias knew he could delay no longer. Much as he had come to love this place and these people, his presence was endangering them. He would have to attempt the journey to the sacred cave, try to find the second mirror, and hope that the ancient stories contained enough truth to guide him home. The night before his departure, the village held a ceremony unlike any he had witnessed. It began at sunset with the lighting of sacred fires and the burning of herbs that filled the air with smoke that seemed to carry prayers and blessings skyward. The entire community gathered in the central plaza, their faces painted with symbols that told the story of his time among them, their voices raised in songs that seemed to weave his spirit into the fabric of their collective memory. Galilei presented him with a medicine bundle containing herbs and objects that she said would protect him on his journey and help him navigate the spiritual dangers he would face. Adai gave him a bow of his own making, along with arrows fletched with eagle feathers and tipped with obsidian points that had been blessed in ceremony. Other members of the community offered gifts both practical and spiritual: food for the journey, clothing suited to travel, ornaments and talismans that carried the power of their prayers. But it was Ayoka's gift that moved him most deeply. She approached him as the ceremony was ending, carrying something wrapped in soft deerskin. When she unwrapped it, he saw that it was a mirror not obsidian like the one that had brought him here, but polished copper that reflected the firelight like liquid gold. "It was my mother's," she said quietly, "and her mother's before her. It is said to show not what is, but what may be. Keep it with you, and when you return to your own time, look into it and remember us." "I don't want to leave," he said, the words torn from him despite his resolution. "This is the first place I've ever felt like I belonged. You're the first person who's ever understood me." Ayoka smiled, but he could see tears in her eyes. "The Sky Spirits sent you to us for a purpose, but not to stay. You must return and use what you have learned here to help prepare for the time of great change. When our descendants face the troubles you have seen in your visions, they will need someone who understands both worlds, someone who can build bridges between the old wisdom and the new knowledge. But how will I find you again? How will I know if what we've shared is real or just a dream?" Instead of answering directly, Ahyoka began to sing, a song he'd heard before but never understood, a melody that seemed to capture all the beauty and sadness of their impossible love. As she sang, she took a pendant from around her neck, a small carved figure of a bird in flight, and placed it in his hands. "The wind remembers all songs," she said when the melody ended, "and the earth remembers all who have walked upon it. When the time comes, you will know." The journey to the sacred cave began before dawn, with Elias accompanied by 2 young warriors who knew the territory and could help him navigate both the physical and spiritual dangers ahead. They travelled light and fast, following game trails and waterways that avoided the main paths used by larger groups. The landscape they crossed was breathtaking in its pristine beauty. Rolling hills covered with forests that stretched unbroken to the horizon, rivers that ran crystal clear and teemed with fish, meadows where wildflowers bloomed in incredible profusion. But Elias found it difficult to appreciate the scenery, knowing that he was seeing it for what might be the last time, that his journey was taking him away from everything he had come to love. His companions were skilled woodsmen, but also spiritual practitioners who understood the sacred nature of their mission. They moved with constant awareness of the spirits that inhabited every tree and stone, stopping frequently to offer tobacco and prayers, reading signs in the flight of birds and the behaviour of animals that told them which paths were safe and which should be avoided. On the second day, they encountered the first real danger. A band of warriors from a rival tribe had been tracking them since dawn, moving parallel to their path but staying just out of sight. Elias's companions recognised the signs: broken twigs arranged in patterns that couldn't be natural, the sudden silence of birds in certain areas, the faint smell of wood smoke from fires that were quickly extinguished. "They want to know why we travel toward the sacred places," one of his guides explained in whispered English he had learned from traders. "Our tribes have old disputes about territory and hunting rights. They may try to stop us, or they may demand tribute." The confrontation came at midday, as they approached a narrow valley that offered the only practical route through a range of rocky hills. The rival warriors emerged from concealment with the fluid grace of men who had perfected the art of woodland warfare, surrounding Elias and his companions with a precision that spoke of careful planning and long experience. Their leader was a man of perhaps 30 years, his face marked with scars that told of many battles, his body decorated with paint and ornaments that proclaimed his status as a war chief. He spoke in a dialect that Elias couldn't understand, but his tone made his meaning clear. They were trespassers in his territory, and they would not be allowed to pass without explanation. What followed was a complex negotiation that revealed the sophisticated diplomacy that existed between the various tribes. Elias's guides identified themselves by clan and family, established their right to travel through the region by citing ancient agreements and mutual obligations, and finally explained the spiritual nature of their mission. The war chief listened with the attention of someone accustomed to weighing the truth and importance of what he heard, asking questions that demonstrated his own deep knowledge of tribal customs and sacred traditions. When the discussion turned to Elias himself, the atmosphere changed dramatically. His pale skin and strange appearance had already marked him as unusual, but when his guides explained that he was a skywalker who'd come through these spirit mirrors, the rival warriors reacted with mixtures of awe, fear, and suspicion. Some wanted to kill him immediately, believing that his presence would bring bad luck to their people. Others argued that he should be captured and brought to their own shamans for questioning. But their leader surprised everyone by approaching Elias directly and speaking to him in heavily accented but understandable English. "You're the one the dream speakers have seen," he said, his eyes never leaving Elias's face. "The pale ghost who walks between the times, bringing visions of sorrow and change." "I don't want to bring sorrow," Elias replied carefully. "I only want to return to my own time and seal the pathway that brought me here." The war chief studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The old grandmother of the western village sent word that one like you would come, seeking the great mirror in the cave of first ceremonies. She said we should let you pass, but also that we should warn you. The spirits that guard that place do not welcome strangers, even those who come on sacred business." "What kind of spirits?" "The kind that remember the time before the world was shaped as it is now," the war chief replied. "The kind that see all times at once and judge whether those who approach them are worthy of the knowledge they seek. Many have entered that cave. Few have emerged unchanged. Some have not emerged at all." Despite this warning, or perhaps because of it, the war chief allowed them to continue their journey. But he assigned 2 of his own warriors to accompany them, men who knew the specific dangers of the region and could provide additional protection if needed. The group that continued toward the sacred cave was now 5 strong, representing an alliance between tribes that might normally have been enemies, united by their recognition that Elias's mission transcended ordinary tribal politics. The landscape grew stranger as they approached their destination. Trees began to show signs of the temporal distortion that was spreading outward from the broken mirror, some with leaves that changed colour and fell repeatedly in the span of minutes, others that seemed to age and renew themselves in endless cycles. Streams flowed uphill in some places, and the sun occasionally appeared to move backward across the sky before resuming its normal course. More disturbing were the glimpses of other times that flickered in and out of visibility like heat mirages. Elias caught sight of massive creatures that had been extinct for thousands of years, of landscapes shaped by glaciers that had long since melted, of buildings and people that belonged to futures he couldn't imagine. The barriers between past, present and future were breaking down, and reality itself was beginning to blur. On the morning of the 3rd day, they reached the sacred cave, and Elias understood immediately why this place inspired such awe and fear. The cave mouth was not a simple opening in the hillside, but a complex formation that seemed to have been carved by forces beyond ordinary geology. Symbols were carved into the living rock, not just the petroglyphs he had seen in his own time, but 3-dimensional sculptures that seemed to move and change as he watched them, telling stories that unfolded in ways that challenged his understanding of cause and effect. The air around the cave shimmered with energy that made his skin tingle and his vision blur. Sounds echoed strangely here. His companions' voices seemed to come from multiple directions at once, and their words carried harmonics and overtones that suggested meanings beyond the literal. Even the sunlight behaved differently, bending in ways that created rainbows where none should exist, casting shadows that moved independently of the objects that supposedly created them. His guide stopped at a respectful distance from the cave entrance and began preparations for a ceremony that would, they hoped, gain them permission to enter. They built a small fire using wood they had carried specifically for this purpose, burned sacred herbs that filled the air with smoke that seemed to carry their prayers directly to the spirits, and sang songs so old that their original meanings had been forgotten, preserved only because of their power to open communication with the guardians of this place. As the ceremony progressed, Elias began to hear other voices joining the songs. Not human voices, but sounds that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the air, from the space between moments. The symbols carved into the cave entrance began to glow with their own light, and the shimmering in the air intensified until it became almost solid, like looking through water. Then, without warning, the voices fell silent, and the glow faded. In the sudden stillness, a figure emerged from the cave, not walking out in any normal sense, but materializing from the shadows as if the darkness itself had taken human form. It was an old woman, ancient beyond measure, her hair white as fresh snow and her skin marked with tattoos that seemed to tell the entire history of her people. She wore robes that appeared to be made of starlight and shadow, decorated with ornaments that defied identification. Some seemed to be made of crystallized time, others of solidified music, still others of materials that had no names in any language Elias knew. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of mountains and the patience of geological ages. She addressed each member of their group in turn, speaking to them in their own languages, calling them by names that included not just what they were called by others, but what they called themselves in the deepest privacy of their hearts. To Elias, she spoke in English that was more perfect than any he had ever heard, as if she had learned the language from its own dreams rather than from human teachers. So, Skywalker, you come seeking passage home, but tell me, what is home to one who has walked between the times? Is it the place where your body was born, or the place where your spirit has learned to sing? The question cut deeper than any blade. Elias looked back at his companions, thought of the village he had left behind, of Ioka, and the life he could have had if he had chosen to stay. Then he thought of the growing instability, the visions of chaos and collapse, the knowledge that his presence was endangering the very people he had come to love. Home is where I can do the most good, he said finally, where I can use what I've learned to help build bridges between your world and mine. The ancient woman nodded as if his answer satisfied some test he hadn't known he was taking. Wisdom grows in unexpected soil, she said. Very well, you may enter the cave, approach the great mirror, attempt the passage back to your own time, but know this. The mirror will demand a price for its use. It may ask for memories, for years of your life, for abilities you value, for connections that bind you to joy. Are you prepared to pay whatever it asks? I am. And if the price it demands is the knowledge you have gained here, if returning to your own time means forgetting everything you have learned, everyone you have loved, will you still choose to go? The question struck him like a physical blow. To return to his own time but lose all memory of this experience, to forget Ayoka and Galilahi and Adai and all the others who had become more family to him than his own blood relatives had ever been, it seemed a price too high to pay. But then he thought of the visions, of the time of great dying that was coming, of the need for someone who could stand between two worlds and help them understand each other. Even if he forgot the details, perhaps some deeper knowledge would remain, some instinctive understanding that would guide him when the time came. Yes, he said, though the word tore at his heart. I'll pay whatever price is asked. The ancient woman smiled, and for a moment she looked like a young girl filled with joy and mischief. That is why you will not have to, she said. The mirror demands sacrifice from those who seek power or knowledge for selfish purposes, but you seek to sacrifice yourself for others. The spirits recognize this, and they will be generous. She turned and walked back toward the cave, gesturing for him to follow. At the entrance she paused and spoke to his companions in their own languages, blessing them and charging them with carrying word of what they had witnessed back to their people. Then she led Elias into the darkness. The cave was vast beyond imagining, its walls and ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to extend into infinity. The floor was carved with symbols and patterns that told the history of the world from its creation to its final ending, and walking across them felt like travelling through time itself. Elias saw the birth of the first people, their expansion across the continent, their development of the technologies and spiritual practices that had allowed them to live in harmony with their environment for thousands of years. But he also saw what was coming: the arrival of European diseases, the wars of conquest, the systematic destruction of everything these people had built. He saw his own descendants playing roles both heroic and villainous in the great tragedy that would unfold over the next centuries, and he understood with crystal clarity why he had been brought here, what knowledge he was meant to carry back to his own time. At the centre of the cave, set into a raised platform carved from a single piece of black stone, was the master mirror. It was larger than the one he had found in his own time, perfectly circular and perhaps 6 feet in diameter, its obsidian surface so flawless that it seemed to be a window into the void itself. Around its edge were carved symbols that seemed to move and shift as he watched them, telling stories in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. This is the first mirror, the ancient woman explained, created by the star people before they returned to the sky, left as a gift and a responsibility for those who would come after. It connects to all the other mirrors, in all the other times. Through it, you can travel not just to your own time, but to any time, any place where the other mirrors wait. Elias approached the mirror slowly, feeling the power that radiated from its surface like heat from a fire. As he drew closer, images began to appear in its depths, not reflections of the cave around him, but visions of other places, other times. He saw the cave in his own era, overgrown and forgotten, the smaller mirror cracked and leaking temporal energy. He saw possible futures where that energy continued to grow and spread, creating paradoxes that would eventually unravel the entire timeline. But he also saw other possibilities, futures where he returned to his own time with the knowledge he had gained, where he used that knowledge to help preserve native cultures and wisdom, where he served as a bridge between the worlds of scientific rationality and spiritual understanding. In some of those futures, the coming tragedy was mitigated, if not prevented entirely. In others, enough was preserved that the healing could begin sooner and more completely. "The choice is yours," the ancient woman said. "You can return to your own time, seal the broken mirror and work to prepare your people for the changes that are coming. Or you can step through to any other time, any other place where your presence might make a difference. The mirror will take you wherever your heart truly wishes to go." Elias stared into the swirling depths of the obsidian surface, seeing 1,000 possible lives, 1,000 different ways his story might unfold. For a moment he was tempted to choose a different time entirely, perhaps the distant future, when the wounds between cultures had healed and he could live in a world that had learned to integrate the best of both traditions. Or perhaps the distant past, when he could warn the first peoples about what was coming and help them prepare more effectively. But as he considered these possibilities, he kept coming back to the same conclusion. His own time, for all its flaws and limitations, was where he belonged. It was where his presence could make the most difference, where his unique knowledge and experience could serve the greatest good. And deep in his heart, he knew that Iyoka was right. He had been sent to this time and place not to stay, but to learn and then return. He reached out and touched the mirror's surface, feeling it ripple like water under his fingers. The ancient woman began to sing, her voice joined by others that seemed to come from the mirror itself, from the walls of the cave, from the very stones beneath his feet. The symbols around the mirror's edge began to glow and move faster, and Elias felt the familiar sensation of falling that had brought him here in the first place. But this time was different. Instead of the chaotic tumbling he had experienced before, he felt himself being carefully guided, protected by forces he couldn't see but could sense all around him. The ancient woman's song followed him as he fell through layers of time, and in her voice he heard promises that what he had learned would not be forgotten, that the love he had found would not be lost, that his sacrifice would bear fruit in ways he couldn't imagine. The last thing he saw before the vision faded was Ahyoka's face, smiling at him across the centuries, her lips forming the words of the song that would connect them across time and space. The wind remembers all songs, and the earth remembers all who have walked upon it. Then he was back in his own cave, in his own time, gasping and shaking as if he had been holding his breath for months instead of moments. The smaller obsidian mirror was still embedded in the wall before him, but even as he watched, cracks began to spread across its surface. Light leaked from the cracks, not the harsh light of his torch, but the soft golden light of another time, another place. He understood instinctively what he needed to do. Drawing on knowledge he couldn't quite remember learning, he began to sing. Not the song Ahyoka had taught him, for that had faded like a dream upon waking, but something deeper, older, a melody that seemed to come from the earth itself. As he sang, he pressed his hands against the cracked mirror, feeling the temporal energy that still flowed through it. The process was exhausting, requiring him to maintain perfect concentration while forces beyond his comprehension flowed through his body and mind. But gradually the cracks in the mirror began to close, the leaking light faded, and the sense of connection to that other time grew weaker and more distant. When the last crack sealed itself, the mirror went dark and cold, just another piece of worked obsidian embedded in a cave wall. Elias collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by exhaustion and a sense of loss so profound it felt like dying. The detailed memories of his time in the past were already fading, becoming vague and dreamlike, but the emotional impact remained. The knowledge that he had experienced something extraordinary, had been part of something larger than himself, had loved and been loved in ways that transcended ordinary human experience. When he finally made his way out of the cave, he found the thunderstorm had passed, and the morning sun was painting the Virginia hills with gold and green. But everything looked different now, not the pristine wilderness he had briefly known, but a landscape already marked by European settlement, already diminished from what it had once been. His uncle Jeremiah was waiting for him at the farm, drunk and angry about his absence. "Where the hell have you been, boy?" "Been gone all night, worried me sick. Probably off in the woods playing Indian again, weren't you? Elias looked at his uncle with new eyes, seeing not just the crude brutality that had always defined their relationship, but the fear and pain that drove it. This was a man who had lost his own dreams, who had settled for less than he wanted and blamed the world for his failures. Understanding didn't make the abuse acceptable, but it made it comprehensible in ways that changed everything. "I was exploring the cave system up in Raven's Hollow," Leia said calmly. "I think I may have found something significant. Petroglyphs, maybe some artifacts. I'd like to document them properly." Something in his tone, some new authority in his voice, made Jeremiah back down from the confrontation he'd been prepared to start. Instead, he grumbled about damn fool boy and waste of time, but he didn't raise his hand or his voice the way he usually did. Over the following days and weeks, Elias threw himself into documenting everything he could remember about his experience. The specific details continued to fade, but the broader knowledge remained, an understanding of Native American culture that went far beyond anything in the books available to him, an intuitive grasp of ecological principles that wouldn't be formally recognised by European science for decades, a spiritual awareness that transformed his relationship with the natural world. He began keeping a journal, filling page after page with observations about plants and animals, sketches of artefacts and symbols, fragments of songs and stories that came to him in dreams. He also began learning everything he could about the native tribes of Virginia, seeking out elderly settlers who had traded with them, reading every account he could find, gradually building a picture of what had been lost and what might still be preserved. But it was when he returned to the cave that he received the confirmation he'd been hoping for, and dreading in equal measure. The obsidian mirror was still there, still dark and sealed, but carved into the stone beside it was a message that hadn't been there before. Navashias Gaia, the wind remembers you. The words were carved in Cherokee syllabary, a writing system that wouldn't be invented for another decade. But somehow Elias could read them, could hear in them the voice of someone he couldn't quite remember, but would never forget. Below the Cherokee words, in English letters that looked as if they had been there for centuries, was a single name, Ayoka. As the months passed, Elias began to understand the true scope of what he had been given. His experience had left him with not just knowledge but a calling, a deep understanding that his life's work must be to serve as a bridge between cultures, to preserve what could be preserved and heal what could be healed. He left his uncle's farm as soon as he came of age, making his way to the nearest city with libraries and schools. Using his father's surveying instruments and his own mysterious knowledge of the land, he found work as a guide and surveyor, slowly building a reputation as someone who understood the wilderness better than men twice his age. But his real passion was for writing and research. He began collecting stories from the last generation of settlers who had direct contact with native peoples, recording their accounts with an accuracy and sensitivity that impressed even skeptical scholars. He learned Cherokee, Creek, and several other southeastern languages, often finding that words and phrases came to him without conscious learning, as if they were memories rather than acquired knowledge. His first book, Voices from the Vanished Land, True Accounts of Native Life in the Virginia Mountains, was published when he was 25 and caused a sensation in academic circles. Unlike other contemporary works that portrayed Native Americans as either noble savages or dangerous primitives, Elias's book presented them as complex human beings with sophisticated cultures, practical wisdom, and spiritual insights that the dominant society desperately needed. More books followed, each one adding to his reputation as the foremost authority on Native American culture in the Southeast. But Elias was careful never to claim credit for insights that weren't his own, always acknowledging that his understanding came from sources he couldn't fully explain, from dreams and visions that felt more like memories than her imagination. He never married, though he had opportunities. Something in him remained forever connected to a love he couldn't quite remember, a relationship that had been perfect in its brevity and impossible in its fulfillment. Instead, he devoted himself entirely to his work, to the mission that had been given to him in ways he was beginning to forget but would never truly lose. As he grew older, his writings became more explicitly focused on preservation and reconciliation. He established schools that taught both European and native ways of understanding the world, founded libraries that collected and preserved oral traditions, and worked tirelessly to document languages and cultures that were disappearing with each passing year. He also became known as a healer, though he never claimed medical training. People came to him with ailments that conventional doctors couldn't cure, and often went away healthier after treatments that combined herbal medicine with something that could only be called spiritual healing. When asked where he had learned such techniques, he would only say that they had come to him in dreams. But perhaps his most important work was less visible. The quiet conversations with government officials about treaty negotiations, the letters to influential people advocating for native rights, the behind-the-scenes efforts to prevent some of the worst excesses of American expansion. He couldn't stop the great dying that he had seen in his visions, but he could mitigate it, could help preserve seeds of knowledge and culture that would grow again when the time was right. In his 60th year, as he sat in his study surrounded by the books and artifacts that represented a lifetime of dedication, Elias received a visitor that changed everything. She was a young woman, perhaps 16 or 17, with the bearing and features that immediately marked her as Native American despite her European-style dress. She approached his house at sunset, walking with a confidence that suggested she belonged wherever she chose to be. When he opened the door to her knock, she spoke a single word in a language he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 40 years, but recognized instantly: grandfather. The word was Cherokee, but it carried layers of meaning that went beyond simple kinship. It was a term of respect for an elder, recognition of spiritual relationship, acknowledgement of someone who had earned the right to be called ancestor, even while still living. "I have been sent to find you," she continued in English that carried the same musical quality he remembered from another voice, in another time. "My grandmother's grandmother left stories about you, about the pale man who lived among the people in the time before the great changes, who learned our ways and then returned to his own people to plant seeds of understanding." Elias stared at her, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "What was your grandmother's name?" The young woman smiled, and for a moment he saw another face, another smile shining through the years like sunlight through water. "Her name was Ahyoka," she said. "She lived to be very old, and she told stories of the Skywalker who came through the spirit mirrors, who learned to sing with the wind and speak with the earth. She said that someday, when the wheel of time turned full circle, someone would come to find him and bring him a message." She reached into a pouch at her side and drew out something that made Elias's breath catch in his throat. It was a pendant, a small carved bird in flight, worn smooth by age and handling, but unmistakably the same one that a Cherokee girl had placed in his hands beside a sacred fire in another century. "She said to tell you that the wind has remembered your song," the young woman continued, "that the earth has remembered your footsteps, that the seeds you planted have grown into trees that will shelter many people in the storms that are coming." Elias took the pendant with shaking hands, feeling the smooth stone warm against his palm as if it had been waiting all these years to return to him. As he held it, memories flooded back, not the detailed recollections he had lost upon his return, but something deeper and more permanent. The sound of Ahyoka's laughter, the feeling of belonging to something larger than himself, the knowledge that love could transcend time and space and death itself. "She also said," the young woman continued, "that when the time of great healing begins, you will remember everything, that the spirits have kept your memories safe, waiting for the moment when they would be needed again." That night Elias sat by his fire holding the pendant and feeling the years fall away like leaves in autumn. The young woman, who had given her name as Atsila, meaning fire, had stayed for dinner and told him stories that filled in gaps in his understanding, that connected dots he hadn't even realized were scattered across his life. Ahyoka had lived to be 93, dying peacefully in her sleep in a cabin deep in the Tennessee mountains, where her people had taken refuge after the Cherokee removal. She had never married, dedicating her life to preserving the old ways and preparing for the time when they would be needed again. She had become a renowned medicine woman and storyteller, and her tales of the Skywalker had become part of the oral tradition of several southeastern tribes. "She said you would know her again," Atsila told him as she prepared to leave the next morning. "She said that souls who find each other across time and space are never truly separated, that the spirits weave them together in ways that transcend single lifetimes." "Will I see her again?" Elias asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Atsila smiled. "She said to tell you that the great circle is completing itself, that the time of ending is also the time of beginning. She said you would understand when the moment comes." After she left, Elias found that his dreams had changed. Instead of the vague, emotional impressions that had haunted his sleep for decades, he began to have vivid, detailed visions of the life he'd lived in that other time. He remembered the village with perfect clarity, could recall conversations word for word, could feel again the sense of belonging and purpose that had defined those magical months. But more than memories were returning. The spiritual abilities he had begun to develop during his time with Aryoka's people were reasserting themselves, stronger now and refined by decades of unconscious practice. He found that he could communicate with animals, could sense the health of plants and trees, could feel the emotional states of people around him with increasing clarity. Most remarkably, he began to receive visits from what he could only describe as spirits. Not ghosts in any conventional sense, but presences that seemed to exist partially in his time and partially in others. Sometimes they were people he had known in that other life, coming to give him messages or guidance. Sometimes they were strangers who sought his help in matters that spanned multiple generations, and sometimes, just sometimes, he caught glimpses of Ayoka herself, not as the girl he had known, but as the elder she had become, still beautiful but marked by age and wisdom and the sorrows she had witnessed. She never spoke during these visitations, but her presence filled him with a peace and joy that sustained him through the increasingly difficult work of his final years. For the world was changing rapidly, and not always in directions that gave him hope. The Civil War came and went, leaving scars that would take generations to heal. The Western expansion accelerated, bringing with it the final destruction of the great buffalo herds and the last free tribes. Industry began to transform the landscape in ways that would have been unimaginable when he was young, and the gap between human civilization and the natural world grew wider with each passing year. But there were signs of hope as well. Some of the seeds he'd planted were beginning to sprout. A new generation of scholars was taking Native American culture seriously, approaching it with respect rather than condescension. Conservation movements were beginning to recognize the wisdom embedded in traditional ecological practices, and here and there bridges were being built between communities that had been enemies for generations. In his 72nd year, as winter settled over the Virginia mountains where he had built his final home, Elias felt the approach of what he knew would be his last great transition. His health was failing, his body worn out by decades of travel and research, and the peculiar stresses that came with existing partially in multiple times. But he was not afraid. The visions that came to him now were of reunions rather than endings, of the completion of patterns that had been decades in the weaving. He saw Ayoka waiting for him in a place that existed outside of time, young and beautiful as she had been when they first met, but also wise with all the experience of her long life. On the night he died, the aurora borealis appeared over Virginia, an event so rare that it was recorded in newspapers across the region. Those who saw it reported that the light seemed to dance and spiral in patterns that reminded them of smoke from sacred fires, and that the wind that night carried sounds like distant singing, like voices calling across impossible distances. The young Cherokee woman, Atsila, was with him at the end. She had appeared at his door 3 days earlier, saying simply that she had been called to come. She sat beside his bed through the final night, holding his hand and singing songs in her own language that seemed to ease his passage from this world to whatever lay beyond. "Can you see her?" she asked softly as his breathing grew shallow and irregular. Elias smiled, his eyes focused on something she couldn't see. "She's here," he whispered. "She's been waiting. She says the great circle is complete. The wind remembers. The earth remembers." His last words were in Cherokee, spoken with perfect pronunciation despite the decades that had passed since he had heard the language spoken. "Nvishiasgaya usti, the wind carries us home." When Atsila went through his papers after the funeral, she found a manuscript he had been working on in his final months, a complete account of his journey through time, written with such detail and precision that it read like a memoir rather than a work of fiction. Attached to it was a note in his handwriting: "For those who will come after, when the time is right for the full truth to be told." She also found the obsidian mirror pendant, the one Ayoka had sent through the generations with its message of remembrance and hope. But when she touched it, the stone was warm, and for just a moment she heard voices, 2 voices, singing together in harmony that transcended time and space and death itself. The manuscript was eventually published, though not for many years. When it finally appeared, readers weren't sure whether to classify it as historical fiction or spiritual memoir. But among Native American communities, it was recognised immediately for what it was, a true account of one man's journey across time and cultures, a bridge built between worlds that had been kept apart for too long, and in the archives of several universities, filed away with other documents deemed too fragile or too strange for general access, were Elias Rowe's field notes and recordings, thousands of pages of Cherokee songs and stories, Creek medicinal formulas, Seminole agricultural techniques, and dozens of other cultural treasures that had been preserved against the day when they would be needed again. The great circle had indeed completed itself. The young man who had fallen through time in search of something he couldn't name had become the elder who built bridges across centuries, who preserved knowledge that would have otherwise been lost, who proved that love and understanding could transcend any barrier that history and hatred might erect. And somewhere in the space between times, in the realm where all moments exist simultaneously, two voices continue to sing together. The Cherokee girl who believed in spirits and prophecy, and the young surveyor who learned that the greatest adventures are not those that take us away from home, but those that teach us what home really means. The storm had been building all afternoon, dark clouds rolling across the New England countryside like an ominous tide. Nathaniel Harrow pressed his face against the barn window, watching lightning fork across the sky in brilliant, jagged lines. At 17, he had seen plenty of storms, but this one felt different, charged with an electricity that seemed to hum in his very bones. The barn around him was cluttered with the remnants of his uncle's madness, or what the townspeople had called madness. Ezra Harrow had been the village eccentric, a man who spoke of impossible things and built contraptions that defied understanding. When consumption finally claimed him 3 months ago, he left everything to his nephew, including a collection of brass gears, copper wiring, and cryptic schematics that covered every available surface. Nate had been working on his uncle's final project for weeks now, trying to decipher the barely legible notes scrawled in the margins of detailed drawings. The device looked like an oversized compass, its brass housing intricate with engravings that seemed to shift in the lamplight. At its centre sat a crystalline lens, and around its perimeter Uncle Ezra had arranged a series of delicate magnetic dials. According to his notes, the device was meant to harness the Earth's magnetic field, though for what purpose, Nate couldn't fathom. Thunder crashed overhead, rattling the barn walls. In the sudden flash of lightning, Nate noticed something he hadn't seen before. A setting on the compass marked simply as origin. It wasn't on any map he knew, wasn't a direction or location that made sense. But Uncle Ezra's final note, written in a shaking hand, had been clear. When the heavens rage, align to origin, and let the earth remember. With trembling fingers, Nate adjusted the primary dial to the mysterious setting. The moment the needle locked into place, the entire device began to vibrate with a low, harmonic hum. The brass housing grew warm beneath his hands, and the crystalline lens at its centre began to glow with an inner light that pulsed in rhythm with the storm outside. Another lightning bolt split the sky, this one so close that the barn filled with the acrid smell of ozone. But instead of dissipating, the electrical charge seemed drawn to the compass. Sparks danced along its brass edges, and the magnetic dials spun wildly as if struggling against some invisible force. "What have you done, Uncle Ezra?" Nate whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing drone of the device. The barn door burst open in the wind, and through it, Nate could see the lightning gathering above in unnatural patterns, spiralling downward like a luminous whirlpool. He tried to step back from the compass, but found himself frozen, his hands seemingly welded to the warm brass. When the lightning struck, it came not as a single bolt, but as a cascade of pure energy that poured through the open door and into the compass. The world exploded into brilliant white light, and Nate felt himself torn apart and reassembled in the space between heartbeats. The last thing he remembered was the sound of time itself screaming as it bent around him. Consciousness returned slowly, accompanied by sounds that didn't belong in any world Nate knew. Gone was the familiar creaking of the barn, the drumming of rain on the roof. Instead, he heard the distant trumpeting of massive creatures, the rustle of unfamiliar foliage, and the splash of water over stones. Nate opened his eyes to find himself lying on soft grass beside a river that ran clearer than any he had ever seen. The sky above was a brilliant blue unmarred by the smoke of any chimney, and the air carried scents both lush and wild. But it was the landscape itself that made his breath catch, rolling hills covered in vegetation that seemed too vibrant, too primal. And in the distance, moving with ponderous grace through groves of trees, were shapes that belonged in the pages of natural philosophy books, not in reality. He sat up slowly, his body aching as if he'd been thrown from a great height. The temporal compass lay beside him, its brass surface now cracked, and one of its delicate gears missing entirely. The crystalline lens at its centre had spider-webbed with fractures, though it still held a faint inner glow. A sound like rolling thunder made him look up just in time to see a creature the size of a barn emerging from the forest. Its curved tusks gleamed in the sunlight, and its trunk swayed as it tested the air. Nate had seen illustrations of mammoths in his uncle's books, but no drawing could have prepared him for the sheer presence of the living animal. This was no world he recognised, no time he could place. The mammoth paid him no attention, moving on towards some distant watering hole. But other sounds were drawing closer, the padding of heavy feet, the crack of branches. Through the underbrush came something that made Nate's blood freeze. A massive cat with fangs like ivory daggers, its muscled body rippling beneath tawny fur. It had caught his scent and was stalking forward with predatory patience. Nate scrambled to his feet, clutching the broken compass, and ran. Behind him came the sound of the great cat giving chase, its breathing like the bellows of a forge. He crashed through bushes and leaped over fallen logs, his civilized upbringing no match for the desperation of pure survival. Just when he thought his lungs would burst, he heard something else. Human voices, raised in warning. A spear flew past his ear and embedded itself in a tree trunk. More spears followed, and the sound of the pursuing cat changed to a snarl of frustration. When Nate finally stopped running and looked back, he saw a group of beings that were unmistakably human, yet unlike any people he had ever encountered. They were shorter than the men of his time, broader of shoulder and thicker of limb. Their hair was wild and their skin weathered by constant exposure to the elements. They wore simple garments of hide and sinew, and their eyes held an intelligence that was both sharp and wary. The one who seemed to be their leader, a woman with prematurely grey hair and scars that spoke of countless battles, stepped forward and spoke in a language that was all clicking, consonants, and flowing vowels. Nate raised his hands to show he meant no harm, though he doubted they would understand the gesture. The woman, clearly the matriarch of this group, circled him slowly, taking in his strange clothes and pale skin. She reached out and touched the fabric of his shirt, her expression puzzled. When her fingers found the temporal compass, she jerked back as if stung. One of the men, a giant with arms like tree trunks and a face marked by ritual scars, growled something that needed no translation. He wanted to kill the stranger and be done with it. But the woman held up a hand and the giant reluctantly lowered his stone-tipped spear. What followed was a halting process of communication through gestures and simple demonstrations. Nate learned that the woman was called Kala and the scarred giant was Drog. Their tribe, the Urukar, lived in a series of caves along the river. They had been hunting when they heard the commotion and came to investigate. As they led him back to their settlement, Nate tried to process what had happened to him. The landscape, the creatures, the people themselves. Everything pointed to an impossible conclusion. He had travelled not just through space, but through time itself. The compass had somehow hurled him back thousands upon thousands of years, to an age when humanity was still finding its place in a world of giants. The caves of the Urukar were larger than Nate had expected, their walls blackened by generations of fires. Cave paintings covered every available surface, depicting hunts and rituals and astronomical observations that spoke of minds capable of abstract thought. The tribe gathered around him, chattering in their flowing language while Kala tried to decide what to do with this strange visitor. That first night, Nate proved his worth in the most basic way possible. The tribe's fire had died down to embers, and the younger members were struggling to restart it with their primitive fire-starting tools. Nate still carried his flint and steel from 1805, and when he struck sparks into a handful of dry tinder, the resulting flame seemed like magic to the watching Urukar. But it was what came next that truly earned their respect. Using principles of leverage that wouldn't be formally described for millennia, Nate showed them how to construct a simple pulley system that made moving heavy stones effortless. When they went hunting the next day, he demonstrated improvements to their spear-throwing technique based on his understanding of physics and trajectory. Slowly, painfully, Nate learned to survive in this ancient world. His soft hands grew calloused from napping flint and working hide. His pale skin darkened under the prehistoric sun. He learned to read the signs that warned of approaching predators and to find water in seemingly barren landscapes. The Uruk began to accept him not as a curiosity, but as one of their own. Among them, one stood out to Nate more than the others. Ina was perhaps 18, with dark hair that caught the firelight and eyes that seemed to hold depth of curiosity, unusual even among her intelligent people. She alone seemed to understand that his knowledge came from somewhere else, some impossible elsewhere that existed beyond the boundaries of their world. When Nate began sketching the phases of the moon on cave walls, using charcoal to create detailed astronomical charts, Ina watched with fascination. She helped him map the movement of stars, and together they calculated the turning of seasons with an accuracy that amazed even Kala. In return, Ina showed Nate things about their world that no outsider had ever been permitted to see. It was Ina who led him to the sacred burial cave, a place where the Uruk honoured their ancestors and sought communion with the spirits of the earth. The cave walls were covered with paintings more ancient than any in the main settlement, depicting hunts and ceremonies that stretched back through uncounted generations. But it was what lay at the cave's heart that made Nate's blood run cold. Partially embedded in what appeared to be fossilised bone was an artefact that had no business existing in this time. It was made of the same brass as his temporal compass, carved with similar symbols and still bearing traces of that same inner glow. But this device was broken, its pieces scattered among the ancient remains as if it had exploded with tremendous force. "How long has this been here?" Nate asked Ina in the mixture of gestures and simple words they had developed to communicate. Her answer chilled him. According to the oldest songs of her people, the metal thing that fell from stars had been in the sacred cave since the time of the first mothers, since the very beginning of memory. Someone else had travelled through time, someone else had possessed a device like his own. And something had gone catastrophically wrong. That night, as the tribe gathered around their fires, the elders spoke of ancient legends. Through Ina's translation, Nate learned of the fire-toothed beast, a creature that had haunted their people's nightmares for generations beyond counting. It was said to be a great cat with fangs like spears and eyes that burned with stolen fire. According to the stories, it guarded something precious, the fire from the stars that had fallen in the time of the first mothers. As the elders' words washed over him, Nate studied the ancient cave paintings more carefully. One image in particular caught his attention, a great cat with something circular and glowing embedded in one eye. The shape was unmistakable. It looked exactly like his temporal compass. When he examined his own device more carefully the next morning, he confirmed what he had begun to suspect. One of the critical gears was indeed missing, torn away during his violent journey through time. Without it, the compass was nothing more than an elaborate paperweight. But if the legends were true, if the fire-toothed beast really did carry a piece of starfire in its eye, then perhaps his gear, or one like it, was still somewhere in this ancient world. Nate began planning in secret, studying the beast's territory and learning everything he could about its habits. The Uruk spoke of it in whispers, describing a creature that had grown far beyond the natural size of its kind, fed by the strange energies of the starfire it carried. It laired in the volcanic canyons to the north, where sulphurous vapours rose from fissures in the earth, and the very ground was hot to the touch. Ina discovered his preparations before he could stop her. She found him crafting a spear with an obsidian point he had knapped to surgical sharpness, bound to a shaft of hardwood with sinews that had been treated to maximise strength and flexibility. His shield was a masterwork of prehistoric engineering, layers of hide stretched over a frame designed to distribute impact across its entire surface. When she confronted him, her eyes blazing with fury and fear, Nate tried to explain. Through gestures and the few words they shared, he told her about the compass, about his need to return to his own time, about the gear that might make it possible. But Ina understood more than he had given her credit for. She knew he was planning to leave, to abandon her and their people for a world she could never comprehend. Their argument continued through the night, but by dawn, Ina had made her decision. If Nate was determined to face the fire-toothed beast, she would help him do it properly. Together, they slipped away from the main settlement before the rest of the tribe awakened. The journey to the volcanic canyons took 3 days of hard travel through increasingly hostile terrain. The very air grew thick and sulphurous as they approached the beast's territory, and the ground beneath their feet radiated heat like a forge. Strange plants grew here, adapted to the hellish conditions, and the few animals they encountered were likewise changed. Smaller, quicker, with eyes that gleamed with unnatural intelligence. They found the beast's lair at the heart of a canyon where the walls wet moisture that stank of brimstone. The cave mouth was littered with bones, not just the remains of ordinary prey, but the fossilized skeletons of creatures that had been extinct for eons. And moving among these ancient remains was the fire-toothed beast itself. It was larger than Nate had dared imagine, easily twice the size of any saber-toothed cat that had ever lived. Its muscles rippled beneath a coat that seemed to absorb light, and its fangs were indeed like spears, curved and gleaming with venom. But it was the creature's left eye that confirmed every legend. Where there should have been an orb of living tissue, there was instead a sphere of brass and crystal that pulsed with inner fire. Nate had prepared as best he could. He had studied the creature's movements from a distance, noting its habits and weaknesses. He had constructed traps using principles of mechanical advantage that wouldn't be formally discovered for millennia. Weighted nets hung ready to drop from carefully positioned stones, and a pit lined with sharpened stakes awaited beneath a covering of carefully arranged branches. But when the moment came, when the fire-toothed beast emerged from its lair and caught his scent, all of Nate's preparations proved insufficient. The creature was too intelligent, too experienced in the ways of hunters who thought themselves clever. It avoided his pit with contemptuous ease and shredded his nets with claws like iron knives. What followed was less a battle than a desperate dance of survival. Nate used fire as his ancestors had, creating barriers of flame that forced the beast to approach from predictable angles. He used his understanding of leverage and momentum to turn the creature's size against it, striking at joints and pressure points with surgical precision. But for every advantage his knowledge gave him, the beast countered with raw power and predatory cunning honed by ages of hunting. The fight raged through the sulphurous canyon as volcanic vents spewed steam and the very stones cracked from the heat. Nate's spear found its mark more than once, but the beast's hide was thick and its vitality seemingly inexhaustible. His shield absorbed blow after blow from claws that could have shattered stone, until finally the bronze bindings gave way and the frame splintered. In the end, it was not superior strategy that saved him, but a moment of pure instinct. As the fire-toothed beast lunged for his throat, Nate threw himself forward instead of back, driving his obsidian spear point up through the soft tissue beneath the creature's jaw and into its brain. The beast's momentum carried it past him, and they both collapsed in a tangle of limbs and blood. When Ina found him, Nate was barely conscious, his body torn by claws and his left arm hanging useless at his side, but he was alive, and more importantly the brass gear was within reach. The fire-toothed beast's death had caused the strange eye to crack and split, revealing the mechanical component that had been fused into its flesh. Extracting the gear required careful work with tools of stone and bone, and it was clear that what they recovered was not exactly what Nate had lost. This piece was older, more corroded, marked by eons of exposure to the beast's alien physiology. But it was similar enough in design that it might serve, might complete the circuit that would allow his compass to function again. The journey back to the caves of the Uakar was a blur of pain and fever. Ina tended his wounds with medicines made from plants he couldn't identify, and somehow kept him alive through the worst of it. When they finally reached the sacred burial cave, Nate was barely strong enough to work, but work he did. By firelight, using tools that Stone Age craftsmen had honed to perfection, he began the delicate process of repairing his temporal compass. The corroded gear had to be cleaned and adjusted, its teeth filed to match the device's requirements. New connections had to be forged using techniques that blended the metallurgy of his own time with the practical knowledge he had gained among the Urkar. The work took days, and all the while, Nate was aware that his time in this ancient world was drawing to a close. The compass was healing, its brass surface regaining its former luster, its crystalline lens slowly clearing as the fractures sealed themselves. Whatever force had brought him here, whether magnetism or something more exotic, was preparing to carry him home. The Urka gathered for what they somehow knew would be his final night among them. They painted symbols on his tattered clothes using pigments made from ochre and charcoal, marking him as one who had walked between worlds. Kala spoke words in their ancient language that needed no translation. Blessing, gratitude, farewell. But it was Ina's farewell that broke his heart. She had taken one of the brass buttons from his 1805 shirt and strung it on a cord of braided sinew. As she placed it around her neck, Nate understood that she meant to remember him always, to carry a piece of his impossible world into whatever future awaited her people. They stood together beneath the aurora borealis, those same northern lights that would dance above New England thousands of years in the future. Ina traced the constellations with her finger, and Nate realized she was showing him the way home, not through space, but through time itself. The storm that had brought him here was building again, though whether it was the same storm or another altogether, he couldn't say. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the temporal compass began to hum with renewed life. Its dials spun freely now, seeking some magnetic true north that existed beyond the boundaries of the ordinary time. As the first raindrops began to fall, Nate activated the device one final time. The brass housing grew warm in his hands, and the repaired lens blazed with the light of captured stars. The Urka watched in amazement as blue fire danced around him, and reality began to bend and twist. The last thing he saw of that ancient world was Ina's face, illuminated by the temporal energies that were tearing him away from her. She was crying, but she was also smiling, as if she understood that some partings were necessary, some journeys had to be completed alone. Then the world exploded into light and motion, and Nate felt himself hurled forward through the screaming corridors of time. He awakened in his uncle's barn, sprawled on the same wooden floor where he had begun this impossible journey. The storm outside was already moving on, its thunder fading into the distance. By the light of his overturned lamp he could see that only minutes had passed since his departure. The same rain was still dripping through the same cracks in the roof. But Nate himself was changed beyond recognition. His clothes were torn and stained, marked with symbols painted in pigments that would not exist for thousands of years. His hands were scarred from working with stone tools, and his left arm bore the claw marks of a creature that had died before human civilization began. Most importantly, when he searched his pockets, he found proof that his journey had been more than a dream. Ina's necklace was there, the brass buttons strung on braided sinew, still carrying the scent of wood smoke in ancient places. In the days that followed, as his wounds healed and his strength returned, Nate began the work of documenting what he had experienced. He completed his uncle's journal, filling in the missing pieces with knowledge gained in the dawn of time. He studied the temporal compass, learning its secrets and preparing for whatever journeys might yet come. But he was careful to hide the device away, knowing that its power was too great for the world of 1805 to understand. Sometimes, on nights when the moon was full and the northern lights danced above New England, he would take it out and hold it in his hands, feeling the pulse of energies that connected all times and places. He thought often of Ina and the Urka, wondering what had become of them in the vast sweep of history. Had they survived to become ancestors of modern humanity? Had their descendants carried forward some memory of the strange visitor who had walked among them? He would never know for certain, but sometimes, in the depths of winter nights, he thought he could hear their voices carried on the wind. The temporal compass waited in its hiding place, patient as only such devices could be. Nate had learned its secrets, but he had also learned the cost of using them. Time travel was not a gift to be used lightly. It was a responsibility that required wisdom, courage, and the willingness to accept that some journeys change the traveller as much as they change the destination. As months turned to years, Nate established himself as an inventor and natural philosopher, though he was careful never to reveal knowledge too far ahead of his time. He married a local girl and built a life that seemed ordinary to his neighbours, but every full moon he would check on the device that had shown him wonders beyond imagination. The brass button on its sinew cord remained his most treasured possession, a reminder of a love that had bridged the vast gulf of time. Sometimes he wondered if he should return, if he could find his way back to that ancient world, and the woman who had helped him become something more than he had been. But deep in his heart, he knew that some journeys were meant to be taken only once. The boy who had stumbled into the past through accident and desperation was gone, replaced by a man who understood that time itself was alive, aware, and infinitely dangerous. The temporal compass would remain hidden, its secrets guarded, until someone worthy enough and brave enough came along to claim them. And on nights when the aurora borealis painted the sky in shades of green and gold, Nathaniel Harrow would stand at his window and remember a cave girl who had shown him that love could exist in any time, in any place, in any form. The button around her neck had been his gift to the past, but her courage and wisdom were her gifts to his future. The storm outside his window began to build again, and for just a moment Nate's hand moved toward the hiding place where the compass waited. But then he smiled and turned away, content to let the lightning flash and the thunder roll without intervention. Some storms were meant to be weathered, not travelled through. Time would call to him again some day, he was certain of that. But until it did, he would live in the present, carrying the past in his heart and the future in his dreams, a guardian of secrets that spanned the ages. Years passed like pages turning in a book written by invisible hands. Nate married Mary Thornton, the daughter of the local blacksmith, and together they built a life that seemed unremarkable to their neighbours. Their farmhouse sat on a hill overlooking the Connecticut River, and their fields produced wheat and corn that fed half the county. To the people of Millbrook, Nathaniel Harrow was simply a successful farmer, with an unusual talent for mechanical contraptions and an uncanny ability to predict the weather. But Mary knew better. She had seen the scars on her husband's body, marks that no New England predator could have made. She had watched him wake from dreams that left him speaking words in no language she recognised, calling out a name that sounded like Ina, in a voice filled with longing and loss. And on nights when the aurora borealis painted the northern sky, she had seen him standing at their bedroom window with tears streaming down his face, staring at something only he could see. Their marriage was built on love and mutual respect, but also on an understanding that some parts of Nate's past would remain forever sealed. Mary asked no questions about the brass button he kept in a locked box in his study, or about the complex mechanical device wrapped in silk beside it. She simply accepted that her husband carried secrets that were not meant for sharing, and she loved him all the more fiercely for the burden she could see he bore. Their children came in due time, first Samuel, then Rebecca, then the twins Thomas and Sarah. Each child inherited something of their father's curiosity and mechanical aptitude, though none showed the obsessive brilliance that had driven Nate to unlock the mysteries of time itself. He taught them to read the stars and predict the seasons, to work with their hands and think with their hearts, but he never spoke of the device that had shown him wonders beyond their comprehension. As the children grew, Nate established himself as more than just a farmer. His innovations in agricultural machinery revolutionized farming throughout the Connecticut Valley. His improvements to watermills and grain processing made him wealthy enough to endow the town's first proper school, and his detailed weather predictions, based on atmospheric observations that wouldn't be formally understood for decades, saved countless crops from unexpected storms. But it was his work as an unofficial doctor that truly set him apart. Using knowledge gained from watching Ina treat his wounds with prehistoric remedies, Nate developed healing techniques that seemed almost magical to his contemporaries. He could set bones so they healed straight and strong, treat infections with plant-based medicines that no physician in Boston could identify, and diagnose ailments by reading signs that other healers missed entirely. The town began to whisper that Nathaniel Harrow had been touched by something otherworldly, though they couldn't agree on what. Some said he had made a pact with forest spirits during a vision quest in the mountains. Others claimed he had studied with Indian medicine men who had taught him secrets passed down from the time before memory. A few of the more superstitious residents suggested he was in league with darker forces, though they kept such thoughts to themselves. Nate bore their speculation with quiet dignity, knowing that the truth was far stranger than any tale they could invent. He had indeed learned from teachers who predated civilization itself, but they had been human beings like himself, just separated from him by an abyss of time that defied comprehension. On his 40th birthday, as he sat in his study reviewing the agricultural accounts that had made him one of the wealthiest men in the county, Nate found himself drawn once again to the locked box that contained his most precious possessions. The temporal compass seemed to pulse with restrained energy, as if sensing his attention. Beside it, Ina's necklace lay coiled like a sleeping serpent, the brass button worn smooth by decades of handling. He had not activated the device in 23 years, but its presence had never left his thoughts. Sometimes he dreamed of the volcanic canyons where he had faced the fire-tooth beast, or of the sacred cave where ancient paintings recorded the passage of time travellers who had come before him. More often, he dreamed of Ina's face illuminated by firelight, her eyes bright with curiosity and affection. What had become of her? Had she lived a full life among the Urka, eventually becoming a matriarch like Kala? Had she taken a mate from among the tribe's hunters, born children who carried forward some fragment of the knowledge they had shared? Or had she died young, perhaps in childbirth or during one of the harsh winters that claimed so many in that unforgiving age? The not knowing was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his exile from that ancient world. He could calculate the orbital mechanics that governed the motion of planets, could predict eclipses decades in advance, could design machines that would not be invented for generations, but he could not reach across 50,000 years to learn the fate of the woman who had saved his life and stolen his heart. As if summoned by his thoughts, a knock came at the study door. Mary entered carrying a tray of tea and sweet cakes, her greying hair pinned up in the practical style she'd favoured since their first child was born. At 55 she was still beautiful, though her beauty had evolved from the fresh loveliness of youth to something deeper and more enduring. "You've been brooding again," she said gently, setting the tray on his desk and settling into the chair across from him. "Every year around this time you get that look, as if you're seeing something the rest of us can't." Nate smiled, though he knew it didn't reach his eyes. Just thinking about roads not taken, paths that might have led to different destinations. "We all have those," Mary replied, pouring tea for both of them. "But dwelling on them won't change anything. The life we've built together is a good one, Nathaniel. Our children are healthy and happy, our community respects us, and we've made our mark on the world. What more could a man ask for?" Before he could answer, young Samuel burst through the door with the enthusiasm that only a 15-year-old could muster. Their eldest son had grown tall and lean like his father, with the same dark hair and intense eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Father, you have to come see this," Samuel exclaimed, his voice cracking with excitement. "There's the most peculiar storm building over the eastern ridge. The lightning is moving in spirals and the thunder sounds like nothing I've ever heard before." Nate's blood turned to ice water. He rose from his chair so quickly that he knocked over his teacup, sending hot liquid cascading across his papers. Through the study window he could see what his son had described, a storm unlike any that belonged to the natural world of 1828. The clouds were moving in patterns that defied the normal flow of weather, and the lightning that flickered within them pulsed with an almost mechanical rhythm. "Samuel, go to your mother and siblings," Nate said, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency. "Make sure they stay inside, no matter what they see or hear. Do you understand me?" The boy nodded, though confusion clouded his features. He had never heard his father speak with such intensity, never seen that particular look of fear and recognition in his eyes. Mary rose from her chair, her own expression growing concerned. "Nathaniel? What is it? What's wrong?" But Nate was already moving toward the locked box, his hands trembling as he withdrew the temporal compass. The device was warm to the touch, its brass housing vibrating with harmonics that seemed to resonate with the approaching storm. The crystalline lens at its centre blazed with inner fire, and the magnetic dials spun wildly as they sought some impossible true north. "Someone else is coming," he whispered, staring at the compass in horrified fascination. "Another traveller is about to arrive." Outside, the storm reached its crescendo. Lightning struck the earth with systematic precision, each bolt following paths that formed geometric patterns visible only from above. The thunder that followed was not the chaotic rumble of natural weather, but a measured cadence that spoke of intelligence and purpose. And then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the storm simply ceased. The unnatural clouds dissipated as if they had never been, leaving behind a sky so clear and star-filled that it seemed like a different world entirely. But in that moment of perfect silence, Nate heard something that made his soul ache with recognition. The sound of a human voice crying out in confusion and fear. Without another word to his wife, Nate grabbed a lantern and rushed from the house. He found the newcomer in the same field where he himself had awakened 23 years earlier, a young woman in clothes that belonged to no era he could identify. Her hair was the colour of autumn leaves, and her skin bore the pallor of someone who had spent too much time indoors. But it was her eyes that confirmed his suspicions. They held the same look of desperate confusion that he remembered from his own arrival in that prehistoric world. The woman clutched a device that was unmistakably another temporal compass, though this one was crafted from silver rather than brass, and bore engravings in a script that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. Like his own device, it was damaged, its crystalline core cracked, several of its delicate mechanisms scattered across the grass. "Where am I?" she gasped, struggling to sit up. "When am I?" The calculations were perfect. The magnetic alignment was exact. But something went wrong during the transition. Nate knelt beside her, his lantern casting flickering shadows across her pale features. "You're in Connecticut, in the year 1828, and unless I'm very much mistaken, you're not from this time any more than I am." The woman's eyes widened with shock and recognition. "You're another traveller? But that's impossible. The records show only 3 successful temporal translations in human history, and 2 of them ended in disaster." "Records?" Nate helped her to her feet, noting the way she favoured her left leg. "What records? Who are you, and when do you come from?" "Dr. Elena Vasquez," she replied, extending a hand in a gesture that seemed natural despite the centuries that separated them. "I'm a temporal physicist from the year 2157, and according to our historical databases, you're Nathaniel Harrow, the man who disappeared during a lightning storm in 1805 and returned with knowledge that shouldn't have existed for another century." Nate stared at her in amazement. In all his years of guarding the secret of time travel, he had never imagined that future generations would not only discover his story, but study it as historical fact. "You came here looking for me?" "In a manner of speaking," Elena replied, gathering the scattered components of her device with practiced efficiency. "We've been studying temporal anomalies for decades, trying to understand how the early experiments were possible. Your case was particularly intriguing because you managed to return safely from a journey that should have been impossible with such primitive equipment." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Eleanor explained the state of temporal research in her own time. Humanity had colonized much of the solar system, developed technologies that seemed like magic to Nate's 19th century perspective, and eventually turned their attention to the ultimate frontier, time itself. But their efforts had been plagued by disasters, paradoxes, and travellers who vanished without a trace. "The mathematics are incredibly complex," she said, limping slightly as they climbed the hill toward his home. "Every journey through time creates ripples that can affect past and future in unpredictable ways. We've lost dozens of researchers to temporal storms, causality loops, and worse. Your uncle's design was crude by our standards, but it incorporated principles that we're only beginning to understand." Mary met them at the door, her expression a mixture of concern and resignation. She had lived with Nathaniel's secrets long enough to recognise when something extraordinary was happening, even if she couldn't fully comprehend its nature. "Another traveller?" she asked simply, as if visitors from the future were a common occurrence. "Dr. Elena Vasquez," Nate replied, helping the injured woman into the parlour. "She's from much further in the future than we are from the past." Over the next several hours, as Elena's wounds were tended and her story unfolded, Nate learned truths that challenged everything he thought he understood about time travel. The temporal compass was not simply a device for moving through time, it was a key that unlocked fundamental forces of the universe, forces that connected all moments and all possibilities in a vast, incomprehensible web. "Your journey to the prehistoric era wasn't an accident," Eleanor explained, studying his own compass with instruments that materialized from hidden pockets in her strange clothing. The device was drawn to a point of temporal significance, a moment when the timeline itself was vulnerable to change. The presence of another time traveller, whoever left that broken device in the cave, created a kind of magnetic attractor that pulled you to that specific moment. Nate felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you saying that someone else, someone from our future, had already visited that time?" "Not our future," Eleanor corrected. "Our past. The remains you found in the sacred cave belong to Dr. Marcus Chen, a researcher from the year 2089. He was part of the first generation of temporal explorers, Using technology that was still experimental and dangerous, his device malfunctioned during the return journey, stranding him in the Pleistocene era where he eventually died. The implications struck Nate like a physical blow. The Urquhart had been dealing with time travellers for generations, not just him, but others who had arrived before and after his own visit. The legends of the fire-toothed beast took on new meaning. Perhaps the creature had been transformed not just by Dr. Chen's device, but by exposure to multiple temporal anomalies over the centuries. How many, he asked quietly. How many travellers have gone back to that time? Eleanor consulted a device that resembled a crystal tablet, its surface displaying information in symbols that seemed to write themselves. Our records show at least 7 confirmed arrivals in the period between 50,000 and 45,000 BCE. Most of them were researchers like Dr. Chen, studying the early development of human civilization. But there were others, refugees from timeline wars, explorers seeking virgin territories, even a few who went back simply because they could. Timeline wars, Mary interjected, her voice sharp with concern. What do you mean by timeline wars? Elena's expression grew grim. In my era, temporal technology became a weapon. Nations, corporations, and ideological factions began sending agents back to change key historical events, trying to create timelines that favoured their own interests. The result was chaos, contradictory histories, paradoxes that threatened to unravel causality itself, and entire civilizations that flickered in and out of existence. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. That's why I'm here, actually. The Temporal Regulatory Commission sent me back to study the early period of time travel, hoping to understand how the original travellers like you managed to avoid the catastrophic side effects that plague our more advanced attempts. Nate absorbed this information with growing horror. His innocent experiment with his uncle's device had been the first link in a chain of events that would eventually lead to wars fought across time itself. The peaceful world of 1828 seemed suddenly fragile, vulnerable to forces beyond his comprehension. Can it be stopped? He asked. These timeline wars, the chaos you describe, is there a way to prevent them? Eleanor's smile was sad but determined. That's what we're trying to find out. The Commission believes that the key lies in understanding the original temporal compass designs, the ones that seem to work in harmony with time's natural flow rather than fighting against it. Your uncle's device, and others like it, may represent a fundamentally different approach to temporal manipulation. As dawn approached, Elena worked to repair her damaged compass using tools and knowledge from an era centuries beyond Nate's comprehension. But the principles she employed were remarkably similar to those he had learned in that prehistoric cave, suggesting that some truths transcended time and technology. There's something else, she said, as she calibrated the device's magnetic resonance chambers. Something the Commission needs you to know. The woman you knew as Ina, she's not lost to history. Her bloodline survived, and her descendants carried forward genetic markers that we can still trace in the modern era. Nate's hands trembled as he set down his coffee cup. You mean she lived? She had children? More than that, Elena replied, her eyes bright with excitement. Her descendants became some of the most successful and influential people in human history. Scientists, explorers, leaders who shaped the course of civilization. It's as if your presence in that ancient time somehow accelerated human development, giving our species advantages that allowed us to achieve things we might never have accomplished otherwise. The revelation left Nate speechless. His brief time among the Urquhart had not been simply a personal adventure, it had been a pivotal moment in human history, one that echoed forward through the millennia in ways he could never have imagined. As Elena prepared to return to her own time, she made Nate an offer that would haunt him for years to come. The Commission would like you to consider joining our research effort. With your experience and your unique understanding of temporal mechanics, you could help us find a way to end the timeline wars before they destroy everything we've built. But Nate looked at his wife, his children sleeping peacefully upstairs, the life he had built in this quiet corner of 19th century America, and he knew what his answer had to be. My travelling days are over, he said simply. I found my place in time, and I intend to stay here. Elena nodded with understanding. I thought you might say that, but the offer stands, for you and for your descendants. The Commission believes that the Harrow family line carries something special, something that makes you natural temporal navigators. With a flash of silver light and a sound like distant thunder, Dr. Elena Vasquez vanished back to her own time, leaving behind only a faint scent of ozone and the knowledge that time itself was far more complex and dangerous than Nate had ever imagined. In the days that followed, Nate found himself looking at his children with new eyes. Samuel in particular seemed to have inherited something of his father's sensitivity to temporal fluctuations, often commenting on weather patterns that had not yet begun to form or predicting events with uncanny accuracy. When the boy asked about the strange lightning that had brought their mysterious visitor, Nate simply told him that some storms were unlike any others, and that wisdom lay in knowing when to seek shelter and when to stand and face the wind. The temporal compass remained in its hiding place, but Nate no longer felt the same urge to use it. His journey to the past had been necessary, perhaps even destined, but it had also been complete. The future, with its timeline wars and temporal refugees, would have to find its own path forward. But on clear nights when the aurora borealis danced across the northern sky, Nate would sometimes take out Ina's necklace and hold it up to the light, imagining he could see through it to that ancient world where a cave girl had taught him that love could transcend any barrier time could create, and he would whisper a prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought him home, and for the wisdom to know that some destinations were meant to be reached only once.